Good morning. I'm really excited to talk to you today about environmentalism. This is a bit of a different lecture. So we typically in like an intro-level history class go section, and we make it kind of chronological, yes, but also very piecemeal. I am going to be talking about the history of environmentalism, not just environmentalism as a current issue, but that's what we're going to be leading up to. And the reason that I want to set aside a whole lecture for it is because I'm actually going to go like way flipping back in time. And I'm going to talk about like Andrew Jefferson, but only for a second. And then because most of the history of environmentalism, especially the really rich history of environmentalism, is 20th century history. So I want to talk about the roots of this movement in the United States. And I want to talk about what it becomes because of a couple of really interesting reasons. First, I want you to understand in this politically fractured world that we live in, right? I want you to understand that environmentalism was once a no-brainer. And that's really critical. Like this understanding that environmentalism was universally an, oh shit, we got to get on board with that by lots and lots of people, right? So I want you to understand that. But two, I also want you to understand how the history of environmentalism intersects with all the other kinds of history that we've been talking about. Talking about environmentalism is the history of the environment, and human beings, obviously, live in the environment. So we're not just talking about like the protection of endangered species. We're talking about the rise of cities. We're talking about segregation and wealth distribution. We're talking about the rise of big industry and globalization and healthcare, and we're talking about a myriad of things, the consequences of which are that the effects of environmentalism are not distributed equally. And that is the thing that in the end ends up making environmentalism a political issue. So I want to talk about an alternate title for this lecture, I suppose, is how environmentalism became like a whole big political thing rather than common sense. And that can be really confusing, but it makes a lot more sense if you use history to answer that question. That's basically the direction that we are going in today. So things that you need to know in regards to those directions. What kinds of things caused environmental degradation? What is environmental degradation? What causes it? Who is responsible for it? It turns out there are actual people behind environmental degradation. So, like, who is that and why can those things happen? In other words, nobody's like, hey, screw the environment, I'm gonna poop on it. But like, who is actually doing that? Because the world would not be collapsing if that wasn't happening. So what causes environmental degradation? Who causes it? Why do these things continue to exist? When was environmentalism popular? As in, when was it universally accepted among Republicans and Democrats and poor people and wealthy people that this was like shit that needed to get done? And what changed that made it a political issue? Third question. Who loses when the environment suffers? Everybody, sure. But who loses more? Can you decide some of those things? Can you pick out some of those things? I'll talk about that at the end of the lecture today. In other words, why is environmentalism a social justice issue? And for that, you need to rely on your reading. Let's get started. Historical roots. Because I'm really flippin' funny, and it's environmentalism and environments have roots. Yeah, I mean, normally nobody would laugh at that, but because I'm giving a video lecture and nobody's laughing at that, it feels somehow worse. At least you would laugh at the attempt, and I'm not getting like any sort of feedback. My dogs don't think that I'm funny. So anyway, historical roots. I'm fucking funny. Okay. You cannot understand environmentalism unless you have some basic concept of what it is. And the best definition I've found is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this definition is, of course, a modern definition, but we will talk about it in relation to history. So, what we have is this. Environmentalism is, and the person who walked in late would have to read this, a political and ethical movement that seeks to improve and protect the quality of the natural environment through changes to environmentally harmful human activities, through the adoption of forms of political, economic, and social organization that are thought to be necessary for, or at least conducive to, the benign treatment of the environment by humans, and through a reassessment of humanity's relationship with nature. In various ways, environmentalism claims that living things other than humans and the natural environment as a whole are deserving of consideration in reasoning about the morality of political, economic, and social policies. Breathe that in for a second. Because you need to think about that shit and I need coffee. Basically, we think of environmentalism too frequently as this like bleeding heart hippie, I care about the environment kind of thing. That's part of it, sure. But it's also really about a re-examination of humans' relationship to the environment. And that's the word that I think is really most important. It's about the way that humans impact the environment and that environments, both man-made and natural, impact humans. It's about that relationship that you have. How is your quality of life changed by the quality of the environment? And how is the quality of the environment changed by your quality of life? These are the ways that environmentalism seeks to understand that relationship better and seeks to basically say, you don't get to do anything that you want to the detriment of the environment because we should probably protect that environment because not for its consequences on you, but in general, it ought to be respected. So that's a broad definition of what environmentalism is. But it comes from the fact that humans have pretty much always been worried about the environment in, look at that, I wrote exactly what I said, in some way or other. So I'm going to go back to Thomas Jefferson here, and I know that we feel like we're going back a crazy long way. If you were in the first half of my U.S. history, this will be familiar to you, all of these things that I'm going to say. And if you were not, it won't be. But that's totally cool because you don't need to know it that carefully. Basically, at various points in American history, shit changed on to the environment and people got worried about it. So if you want to go way back, you can think about Thomas Jefferson and his emphasis on the natural environment as what America was. And we can see this in notes in the state of Virginia. But Thomas Jefferson's really worried about how people interact with that environment. He particularly stresses that the only moral way to be a democratic citizen is to be a farmer. Why? Because that relationship with the land is what you need in order to be the basis of a democratic society. So Jefferson actually connects this respect for the land directly to the concept of democratic politics. So for him, land ownership and working the land was deeply tied to citizenship. There's a respect for the land and an ownership of the land that is part of citizenship to him. As the United States industrialized, as it looked different than that agrarian economy that Thomas Jefferson envisioned, people freaked, and they had to worry about the impact they were having on the environment, but also the impact that the environment was having on humans. So take, for instance, the 1840s. This is when we have the first wave of market revolution. This is when we have the first rise of cities. People freak out about the concept of a city. People said that cities breed moral corruption, that they make people sick, and they had good reason to believe that because people died of like cholera and tuberculosis and stuff in cities because sanitation was not great. So they thought that they bred moral corruption just as much as they bred physical corruption, because in the 1840s, via medicine, those two things were tied. So many people moved out of the cities and started utopians. Utopias being this, like, it's a way to think about society that starts in the wild from the ground up. And like several of those people were Henry David Thoreau, were Ralph Waldo Emerson, people that really believed that you needed to escape that. That concern grew even more with the further development of industry in the 1890s. And in the 1890s, people started to have more serious health concerns for the people working there. This is when we see muckraking journalism, which we did talk about in this class, right? being concerned about the effects of an urban environment and the way that things are being made in an urban environment on consumers. So worried about poor air conditions. There's a lot of concern among people like Jane Addams that ran the Hull House were like, cities are corrupting immigrants' lungs because they're really dirty, and that's the reason that everybody has tuberculosis. And that was like not untrue. So, not untrue, it was true, right? So there's a lot of concern about the environment, about poor conditions, about how that impacts consumers, but also how that impacts workers because of that newly, really industrial environment. So it starts with the rise of the city, but it really comes to fruition with the rise of the very urban industry. So basically we see that as Americans have impacted the environment in various moments, they have also spoken to their relationship to that environment and most of the time been pretty panicked about it. The first environmental push, though, arguably came in the New Deal. And essentially in the 1930s, it was really hard to ignore the environment because the reason that all of this shit happened that we've already talked about, called the Great Depression, was because the environment was absolutely devastated. Part of that was luck. It was the fact that there was a big drought and the Midwest dried up. But the Dust Bowl was also caused by human interaction, over-farming, depletion of the soil, a lack of irrigation, a lack of systems to cope with drought, right? So because of that, FDR, and this is part of the genius of FDR as a leader, right? He's like, you know what? The environment caused the Great Depression. We caused the destruction of the environment. So we are now in a moment that is partially of our own making. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all these radical social programs because I need to employ people. But if they're going to be working anyway, they might as well fix that environmental shit. So the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and later the Works Progress Administration, both wings of FDR's first and second New Deal, were charged with getting out there and fixing the environment to like even a military extent. They were just absolutely utilized, and they did a lot of different things. FDR very famously set aside lands, although it was not the first federal land to be set aside as a national park. That actually happened in, 1893. Someone is going to fact check me on that. It's either 1893 or 1896, and it was Yellowstone. I'm going to bet my bottom dollar it's 1893. See, in class, one of you would have gotten mad and Googled that, so we're going to go, okay, Google. When was Yellowstone preserved?
1872.
1872?
According to history, the Yellowstone Act of 1872 designated the region as a public pleasuring ground, which would be preserved from injury or spoliation of all timber, mineral deposits.
I don't believe that. I think it was in the 1890s. Anyway, okay. Well, one of you would have fact-checked me and yelled at me. But anyway, it was in the 19th century that the first parks were set aside. But in the 19th century, they were basically just set aside. Nobody did anything with them. FDR went and did a lot to them because of needing to employ the folks in the CCC and the WPA. So they did things like they made fire roads and fire towers so that people could like stand up in them and be like, hey guys, there's a fire, you should do something about that. And then people could drive in on the road and do something about that. So fire roads, fire towers, these things required a lot of labor. But they also made irrigation systems, ditch systems for farms. They also planted trees so that and bushes to avoid soil erosion. They also fought forest fires and brush fires. They also made dams. They also helped preserve certain species. They also made recreational facilities. Basically, this was the first giant push to really do something about the environment. Even as what you see, the picture here that you see is a picture of the Hoover Dam, right? Named after Herbert Hoover. The dam was supposed to be a way to prevent the kind of drought that had happened before and also to get electricity. So FDR is really trying to be creative about ways to both employ people but also prevent that kind of economic collapse. The key problem was that FDR was really trying to cope with consequences, but he didn't cope with causes. So he was really trying to say, okay, well, we are in a drought, cool. Or, well, we are facing soil erosion, cool. But he didn't actually target the things that did that. He just tried to fix with it post-fact. But for instance, well, one of the reasons was because we had declining crop prices, which made people need to overproduce, and that was a problem. So we have causes and consequences, and FDR is not awesome at being able to address both, but he's very awesome at being able to address the consequences. And that was what the U.S. needed in the moment, especially in the moment of the Great Depression, when that really got people out of poverty. So the next major moment comes in the 1960s, and I know I'm skipping the 1940s and the 1950s here. The reason is because I don't have all morning, and you would be pissed at me if we had all morning. So basically I want to recap pretty quickly that the 1940s saw some environmental disasters, although not many. Mostly people were focused on World War II during this time, and of course there was massive devastation during World War II. But probably the most important thing, environmentally speaking, that happened in the 1940s was the creation of the atomic bomb and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, in addition to the human death toll, caused massive environmental problems. In the 1950s, there were a significant amount of accidents in the United States, as well as globally, and I'll refer to them a little bit later, but especially in the coal industry, especially in mining, and also in factories, but people didn't think of factories as environment right then. So there's some serious environmental problems that are going on. Oh, and industrial smogs that are happening. But in the 1960s, those occurrences become much more frequent. And so in the 1960s, people really start to see environmental problems because of the massive clusters that are happening around the world. There's also the publication of the first major environmental text, and that is Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring. The term Silent Spring comes from this vignette she has at the beginning of the book, where she's like, this is what the ideal landscape used to look like, and all of a sudden that spring is not running anymore, and the birds are dead, and the insects are dead. And basically what she's trying to argue in the book is that we are using far too many pesticides in farming. Pesticides that are harmful, and she was very right about that. I mean, she had background enough to say that as a scientist, but people were using a lot of pesticides in industrial farming, specifically because of the large crop outputs needed during World War II. And those pesticides had things like arsenic in them. And it turns out that, here's a radical idea, when you grow crops and you use arsenic to get rid of the weeds, the arsenic is in the crop, and then you eat the crop. And is it a small dose of arsenic? Yes, but you eat bread every day. So think about the overall impact of that. Carson's book was really interesting because she did two things at once. She said, pesticides are destroying our environments, and pesticides are destroying our bodies. These are not out there somewhere. These are things we consume every day. And three things. Research has actively covered this up because it supports farming industry. So a lot of people thought that she was a conspiracy theorist, but also, she had the science to back it up, and people were incredibly concerned. They were also most concerned about the fact that the government had covered a lot of this up and tried to censor her book. And it made people think about, oh shit, if we didn't know that, at all, what else don't we know? There were a couple major disasters as well that led to the recognition that environment was a serious problem. For instance, industrial fogs in London. They called them the Great Fog, but it was smog. It was very dangerous smog that was toxic to people. There was a fog in 1952 that killed 4,000 people in London. There was another one in 1962, though, and it only killed 750. So people are like, okay, what's the difference? The difference is a Clean Air Act. So London had actually had regulatory practices on what chemicals you could release into the air, and because of that, less people died. So was the London fog of 1962 terrible? Yes, of course it was terrible, but it was less terrible, and so people are saying, okay, the environment is shit, but wait a second here. What history is showing us is that we can do something about it. New York suffered its own industrial fog in 1963, 1 year after the last major fog in London. So cities like New York, and New York's not alone, there's also cities like Pittsburgh, major industrial areas are starting to see that kind of fog. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, These early cities to industrialize are starting to see that. And there's a panic about that. People in 1952 and 1962 in London, while it was only 100 and some of this, it's in the notes, forgive me for forgetting, 100 and some people in 1962, like, this fog settled and they literally just dropped dead. They dropped dead immediately. Other people died of lung complications later. But, like, these were terrifying things. Like, a fog can settle and civilians can just die like flies. So people were panicking. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson received a report. And he received a report from scientists internationally, but also from his own advisors. I have that report for you, actually. If you would like to look it up, that link takes you here. And the report was called Restoring the Quality of Our Environment by the Environmental Pollution Panel of the President's Science Advisory Committee. And it basically said, although they won't tell you this here, shit's bad. And we are responsible. Pollution is now one of the most pervasive problems of our society. With our numbers increasing and with our increasing urbanization and industrialization, the flow of pollutants to our air, soils, and water is increasing. This increase is so rapid that our present efforts in managing pollution are barely enough to stay even, surely not enough to make the improvements that are needed. So Lyndon B. Johnson receives this report, and he takes it seriously. Particularly what the report points out most, which is carbon dioxide, which increasingly is seen as a problem. Carbon dioxide is one of the kinds of gases that cannot readily be, scientists are going to kill me for this overview, that cannot readily be absorbed. And so carbon dioxide is changing the shape of our ozone, essentially, and making the world hotter. This is what is leading to global warming. And I'm sorry for those of you that actually study science, that was my historian's interpretation of it. It's not false, it's just not complete. Anyway, Lyndon B. Johnson is in 1965 pointing out the consequences of carbon dioxide. And he is, Franklin Roosevelt and earlier presidents had pointed out environmental degradation. But Lyndon B. Johnson's the first president to really get a report from an international body of scientists and from a presidential advisory committee. And he's the first one to say, hey, the science doesn't look good. We need to do a lot more. Lyndon B. Johnson said in 1965, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. The longer we wait to act, the greater the dangers and the larger the problem. He was right about carbon dioxide, but there were also a lot of other problems that were environmental in nature. In addition to carbon dioxide, people were exposed to, people were exposed to lead. Lead was actually endemic in the 1960s. You would be astonished at how much lead is in society in the 1960s. And lead is dangerous mostly because it's insidious. It's dangerous mostly when you encounter it daily in your environment, and people most certainly were. They were encountering it in house paint, in children's toys, in dishes, in appliances, and in pipes. And all of these things are things that we are exposed to daily, right? And exposed to in a significant way. You eat off of dishes. You drink the water from pipes. You paint the walls in your home and touch the walls in your home with lead-based paint. And children stick toys in their mouths and stuff. So this is significant exposure to these things, particularly because it's usually where food and water and living happens. One of the main problems about those things is that that built up the infrastructure of the U.S., and those things stay around for a long time. Not so much toys, but things like appliances. You could have an appliance for 50 years. Things like pipes are the basis of cities, and I don't know when you guys started paying attention to politics, but one of the things that you should know is that Flint, Michigan is currently fighting lead-based contaminants in their water because of the fact that the pipes were established when nobody knew that lead was wrong. And now those are concentrated in poor areas that don't have the money to renovate. So these are long-standing problems. They're problems that are endemic to the 1950s and 60s, but they're also long-standing. There were only recently laws that said that houses with lead paint needed to be stripped and painted again before they could be purchased. But the thing that actually gets people, despite the fact that those are all very close contact, is gasoline. That's what really makes people panic, because there's a study that comes out about gasoline that says gasoline is totally cool, it is not harmful at all. And then it was exposed that that study was actually tied, of course, to the oil company that produced the gasoline. So there's concern over gasoline primarily, but that leads to an examination of all of these other things and the overall impact of lead. Because when people realize how dangerous lead is in gas, they're like, yeah, but I'm putting gas in my car. My child is sticking his toy car in his mouth. So we have some concerns there. Oh, and also traditional Fiesta wear, by the way, that like bright colored. I find this important enough to Google. So they have new ones of it now, but this like old traditional Fiesta wear, if you have that like leftover from grandparents or whatever, this used to be popular, super popular in the 1950s, that shit is lead-based paint, so please don't eat from there. Cool. That's your public service announcement for the day. Moving on. There's another disaster in 1968 that is particularly interesting. This is the Farmington mine disaster. The Farmington mine disaster was one of several mine disasters. And again, that's going back to 1947. There was, Centralia is going to be the like key word here. But in 1947 in Centralia, Illinois, there was an explosion that killed 111 people in a mine. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, in 1952, there was a controversial decision to seal up a mine that meant that the entire town was literally on top of fire and had to be relocated. This is the central premise of like all sorts of video games and whatnot, and a completely deserted town in Pennsylvania that's actually kind of cool to visit. But basically, what you can think of all of these disasters is this. Coal is volatile. It's explosive. Mining coal is crazy dangerous, and the nation needed a shit ton of coal. The people that mined coal were typically Appalachia rural workers that were very poor, many of them immigrants. Those coal miners suffered a lot. They suffered because working in a mine was very dangerous work, but they suffered too because the longer that you did it, the more susceptible you were to having coal lining your lungs and causing you not to be able to breathe, a condition that people called black lung. A lot of times when coal explodes, the mines collapse and they kill whoever is in them. Other times, mines catch fire, veins of coal catch fire. And what towns decided to do when that happened, because it was impossible to put out, was like to pour cement down them and seal them up. And that's what happened in a couple of places. And that means that the townsfolk are all vulnerable to like explosions because they are living on a sealed up mine. So anyway, one of the things that I've linked you in here to that we would watch if we had more time is a person recalling the Farmington mine disaster. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but you will watch some.
On November 20th, 1968, at approximately 5:30 a.m., an explosion occurred in the number 9 mine of the Mountaineer Coal Company near Farmington, West Virginia. At that time, 99 miners were working underground. Of the 21 miners who survived the explosion and were able to escape to the surface, 8 were working in the 7 South section. 2 of these miners were willing to share their experiences.
We were building stoppings on the section. We were making a left turn around this top end of this fan shaft. To go around that block of coal was from 1 south to 7 south. And there's a lot of acres in there and hundreds of gas wells. active and inactive. And they were going around the backside to try to mine some of it out from there back from 7 South back to 1 South. I didn't know at the time that the fan was down, but somebody, a rumor said that it was down at 2 o'clock. And the mine didn't go till 5:25.
So I'm going to pause him there. But one of the things that you just heard him say is the fan was down at 2 o'clock and the mine didn't blow until 5:25. In other words, the thing that circulates the air, right, was shut off and nobody addressed the problem for 2.5 hours. Basically, coal raised a lot of issues. Coal raised the fact that, first off, we are burning this fossil fuel, and that is increasing carbon dioxide, and that is a serious problem. 2, we have very aggressive companies that are mining this coal and taking advantage of their workers, that are not providing safety regulations at all, that are not providing workmen's compensation at all, that are really harming the environment of the towns that they work in and are causing these towns to literally collapse. So there's a connection here between labor activism and environmental activism, and that connection is actually fairly strong in the 1960s and the 1970s. You have people in rural Appalachia that are like, yeah, environmental devastation is part of our lives. That is something that we are focused on. And that happens because there's so much need for coal in an increasing shipping, industrialized world that need is just insatiable. Then there's another thing that is important because of how damned visible it is. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland literally caught fire. How on earth does a river catch fire? It turns out this is not the first time it happened. This is actually a photograph from 1952 on the right. The river is one that is full of pollutants, that had a couple of notable ship crashes and spilled oil, but there was so much oil on top of the river that literally caught fire. And people are like, I'm sorry, hold on, hold the phone. We're living in a world where a river can burn? How is that even logical? The Cleveland Historical Society, if you're interested in the Cuyahoga River fire, which of course you are, has a really cool exhibit on it, where you can check out some of the primary sources. Like political cartoons that show who is responsible, and this one shows industrial waste, right? Particularly pointing out one person, and it shows how the river is disgusting. So there's some interesting resources here. Things pulled from the Cuyahoga River. If you are interested in the river burning, there is a lot here to check out. Okay? Cool beans. And then we enter the 1970s. By 1970s, people are very concerned. There's concern about rivers, there's concern about pollution, there's concern about coal, there's concern about the dwindling natural resources in other regards. So by the 1970s, people are pretty aware of environmental issues. Pardon me. Totally good. And there's widespread support to get some shit done about it. That comes from Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon establishes the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, so very shortly after he's elected. But he also continues to advocate for it. So this is from his State of the Union address in 1970, and I want to play you a small excerpt from it. You can go to the Miller Center, which is an awesome thing, online. And the Miller Center has a library of presidential speeches. This is where I pulled, who did we watch last that I pulled from? I think I showed you a speech by Lyndon B. Johnson. I think I showed you a Lyndon B. Johnson speech last. Anyway, Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. This is Richard Nixon in his State of the Union address in 1970. You can see the transcript here if you want, but I've already set it to play a very specific moment in the transcript.
I now turn to a subject which, next to our desire for peace, may well become the major concern of the American people in the decade of the 70s. In the next 10 years, we shall increase our wealth by 50%. The profound question is, does this mean we will be 50% richer, in a real sense, 50% better off, 50% happier? Or does it mean that in the year 1980, the president standing in this place will look back on a decade in which 70% of our people lived in metropolitan areas choked by traffic, suffocated by smog, poisoned by water, deafened by noise, and terrorized by crime? These are not the great questions that concern world leaders at summit conferences. But people do not live at the summit. They live in the foothills of everyday experience.
Shout out to Appalachia there.
And it is time for all of us to concern ourselves with the way real people live in real life. The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings? Or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of this country. It is a cause of particular concern to young Americans, because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are needed now if we are to prevent disaster later. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. If we act now, they can be. We still think of air as free, but clean air is not free. And neither is clean water. The price tag of pollution control is high. Through our years of past carelessness, we incurred a debt to nature, and now that debt is being called. The program I shall propose to Congress will be the most comprehensive and costly program in this field in America's history. It is not a program for just 1 year. A year's plan in this field is no plan at all. This is the time to look ahead, not a year, but 5 years or 10 years, whatever time is required to do the job. I shall propose to this Congress a $10 billion nationwide clean waters program to put modern municipal waste treatment plants in every place in America where they are needed to make our waters clean again, and do it now. The industrial capacity, if we begin now, to build them all within 5 years. This program will get them built within 5 years. As our cities and suburbs relentlessly expand, those priceless open spaces needed for recreation areas accessible to their people are swallowed up, often forever. Unless we preserve these spaces while they are still available, we will have none to preserve. Therefore, I shall propose new financing methods for purchasing open space and park lands now before they are lost to us. The automobile is our worst polluter of the air. Adequate control requires further advances in engine design and fuel composition. We shall intensify our research, set increasingly strict standards, and strengthen enforcement procedures, and we shall do it now. We can no longer afford to consider air and water treat them as scarce resources, which we are no more free to contaminate than we are free to throw garbage into our neighbor's yard. This requires comprehensive new regulation. It also requires that to the extent possible, the price of goods should be made to include the costs of producing and disposing of them without damage to the environment.
I'm going to pause that there, but you can continue reading. Nixon goes on to talk about the fact that we often say that there's a contradiction between economic growth and preserving the environment, so that we have to either do one or the other. And he talks about how to not make that happen. He basically talks about the fact that you're going to marry environmental regulation and business, and that hadn't been talked about before. Nixon is a Republican. This does not sound like Republican shit to say, which is one of the things that I want to point out to you. Like, under this administration, real shit gets done. The EPA has, Environmental Protection Agency, has a lot of power. It manages to pass in like 3 years a crap ton of standards and legislations that protected people and regulated industry. Like, they do a lot really, really rapidly. Restrictions on lead, especially toys and paint. The Clean Air Act, which regulated how much industrial waste you can have. The standards on air pollutants, which defined what air pollution is. The danger level definitions, so that you can prevent people from moving to areas that have danger level. Phasing out lead fuel in gas. And banning DDT, one of the most dangerous pesticides. So there was like a significant amount of work done, protecting drinking water, funding research on carbon dioxide, looking into alternative fuels. Basically, this organization got up and running within just a few years. And that made people freak out, because you have, partially because of the EPA, a growing body of people that are concerned about how much say the government has in business. You can't tell me how much to pollute. You can't tell me what I can and can't use on my crops. You can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that libertarian strain and the increasing religious conservative strain that we have been talking about gather together and join forces in the 1980s to elect Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is not a super huge fan of the EPA. Ronald Reagan is not a huge fan of the EPA because the EPA regulates business. He said that the EPA was far too strong of a governmental check on businesses. Reagan couldn't actually take away the institution, but what he did is he appointed somebody named Ann Burford to head it. Burford was a champion of industry, and she actively worked against the policies of the EPA. The EPA was doing several remarkable things regarding waste management, and she tried to defund those. Interestingly, Trump also could not dismantle the EPA, but what he did was he hired Scott Pruitt to head the EPA. He resigned amongst a scandal regarding oil, and Andrew Wheeler took over, originally as the acting head, but now confirmed. And he also is a supporter of big business. So one of the things that Republican governments have done is that they have put someone in charge of the EPA that they feel reflects their stance on how much the government should be involved in business. So how exactly did Burford help to dismantle the EPA? She cut the EPA's funding. She said, we don't need this much money, we're not using this much money, we should not have this much funds. She also settled rather than fixing. So when lawsuits were brought before the Environmental Protection Agency, clearly this was not all about spending. This is why it's not just about government spending. When lawsuits were brought before the federal government, rather than making sure that regulations were put in place to prevent them from happening again, she would give a slap on the wrist to companies and a lot of money to the people that had been violated and sweep it under the rug. So rather than like addressing their cause and creating an act that said you can't dump here or you can't pollute the air in this way, et cetera, she would push for lawsuits to be settled outside of court. And under Burford, basically, the EPA ignored many of the international concerns that scientists were raising, particularly ozone concerns. as well as weird environmental occurrences in the United States, like acid rain. The lawsuit that eventually got Burford kicked out of heading the EPA was about waste management in New York. It was found that the organized crime in New York, the mafia, was helping industries to dump waste into a river, and that waste was violating the EPA, and Burford overlooked it. So she eventually had to resign. But nonetheless, her EPA shows that Republican presidents became concerned about this environmental work under Reagan, and they hadn't been under Nixon. Despite that fact, the world continued to suffer from incredible environmental disasters, just that many of those disasters increasingly happened abroad. So one of the things that the world looked at was the Bhopal disaster in 1984, which continues to be widely regarded as the worst environmental disaster in history. We're going to watch an account, a newsreel of that from 1984. This is a website on the EPA's own history, if you want to check that out. I've got that linked into the slide.
Well, India tonight, another horror story continues, the aftermath of that poison gas leak that has killed more than 2,000 people. Today, the Indian state government in Bhopal filed a criminal negligence suit against a subsidiary of Union Carbide, which has been operating the plant from which the gas escaped.
Now, why am I showing you this in a 100-level U.S. history class? Because the people that were invested in that particular industry were American. Remember last time how we talked about industry moving abroad because of less environmental regulations? This is one of the places in which that happened.
John Cochran reports tonight, the suffering goes on as officials try to determine just what went wrong.
It is too early to call these people survivors. Some will die within 6 weeks as their livers, kidneys, and lungs deteriorate. Nothing can be done for them. And there is also danger to those who escaped the poison gas. Dead animals litter Bhopal, raising the chance of disease. No one knows whether the food is contaminated. Water is trucked in from other towns. 100,000 people suffered either temporary or permanent eye damage. Some are blind. Some can see but must avoid sunlight. All are bewildered. Wyatt troops were on guard but had little to do with the slum where so many died and from which so many fled. Most of those who stayed are too weak to leave, too weak even to be angry. This afternoon, Union Carbide's Chief Safety Officer, Ron Van Minen, arrived to head the company's investigation into the leak.
We have many of the same questions.
God, can I just say that nobody ever has looked as much like a Ron as he looks like a Ron? I hope nobody in this class is named Ron. I don't think
The
they are.
plant is off limits to everyone, and that includes company employees. The government is concerned that someone might tamper with the evidence. Early reports say the accident occurred at an hour when skilled supervisors were at home in bed. Midnight Sunday, pressure and heat build up in an underground tank. Low-level maintenance workers have no idea what to do as 15 tons of toxic chemicals automatically begin moving into a second tank designed to neutralize the poison. It doesn't work fast enough. Pressure blasts the now vaporized chemical past a safety valve into the air. One worker fights the leak but is overcome by gas. He survives. The others flee, one bicycling for help. An hour has passed before a supervisor arrives from home and stops the leak. The damage has been done. A government chemist says a qualified supervisor should have been on duty round the clock.
Such an accident happens. A few anticipatory measures could have been taken. In this case, I am very clear that the thing which was done after 1 hour could have been done within a few minutes.
When the shock of the Union Carbide tragedy has finally subsided, India will still be a poor third world country. It will still desperately need Western industries. But the Indian government cannot guarantee high safety standards.
Is the Indian government responsible for guaranteeing high safety standards? Or are the people that invest responsible for guaranteeing high safety standards? And what about the damage that this is doing to India, that it's not doing to the United States? This raised all sorts of questions about the role of industry abroad, especially because it was a complicated phenomenon in which supervisors were not present, and those supervisors were Western, and the workers were present, and they were the ones that suffered. In 1985, there's a very important scientific discovery, which is the first ozone hole, which is not the first ozone hole, but was the first discovered ozone hole over Antarctica. And this ozone hole really showed that greenhouse gases, rising greenhouse gas levels, was not a threat to the ozone. It had already destroyed the ozone. So it wasn't like something that we would need to worry about in a few years. It was something that was actively happening. And of course, in 1986, Chernobyl melts down. We talked about this in the course of the global fall of communism, but it also made people really worry about the impact of humans on the environment.
Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence, in the form of mild nuclear radiation, had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia. We begin with ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans and no accident had occurred at that plant, it was shut down. And as tests were conducted, similar puzzling reports of high radiation came in from all over Scandinavia. But still, no accidents were reported, leading to the conclusion that the problem was elsewhere, to the east, in the Soviet Union. A fact confirmed to the Soviet people on television tonight.
An official announcement from the Council of Ministers. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station. One of the atomic reactors was damaged. The consequences of the accident are being taken care of. Help is being given to the victims of the accident. A government commission has been set up.
The civilian plant in question is in the Ukraine. It's something of a showcase facility, featured here in Soviet Life magazine, which extolled its safety record. It's near the city of Kiev, population 2.5 million, and about 1,000 miles from Scandinavia, meaning that whatever did occur there, a radioactive cloud headed north across. Radiation levels were 5 times normal, to Finland 6 times normal, to Norway up 50%, and Sweden illegally high.
It's almost certainly the most severe accident that has ever taken place in the short history of civilian nuclear power.
That means it is far worse than the 3 Mile Island incident of 1979. Experts tonight say the cloud of radiation is now dissipating over the North Atlantic and poses no further threat to anyone. But as the Soviets treat an unknown number of casualties, there's no way to say how much lasting damage that cloud may have already caused.
And that's certainly true. Of course, the Chernobyl accident caused a significant amount of human death, but really, what people were focused on in the United States, and that's a double-edged sword, right? What people were focused on in the United States was the environmental impact, because the environmental impact didn't just hurt the people who were killed there, but all of the surrounding countries. And it made people really worry about what impact alternate energies were having on people. And then there was the Exxon oil spill in 1989. The Exxon oil spill was a disaster that absolutely should have been avoided, that killed thousands of large marine creatures. Exxon Oil was held responsible for this, but the person that was actually supervising, that was supposed to prevent the oil spill, got 1,000 hours of community service. Like the hell, do you have any idea how many whales you just killed? This is not a newsreel. This is me having fun with you now, because see, I'm a fun person.
Hello, I'm Tony Hayward, President and
There was a significant oil spill in 2013 by BP, and South Park ripped on what the person from BP did. Basically, the connection I'm drawing here is that they did the same thing in 1989, but I find this really funny, and I think about it all the time. This is what industry does when they spill oil.
CEO of BP. Our accidental drilling spill again in the Gulf is a tragedy that should have never happened. And to all those affected, I want to say, we are deeply sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. Sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. Sorry. We're sorry. I'm deeply sorry. Sorry.
Okay. That was basically my hilarious way to show you that when companies spill oil, they basically say, we're sorry. No, really, we're sorry. But they don't do anything about it. And that was the concern, which also happened in 1980. And also, again, South Park is awesome. 1990s saw the rise of a president that was much more friendly to environmental concerns. And under Clinton, some things actually started to get done. One of the things that's important is that by the 1990s, these things had become so visible, had become so serious, that most of the public was aware of it, and most of the public was very alarmed. Global temperatures were on the rise. Global warming was a well-known phenomenon. Scientists were not really debating it anymore. I'll get back to that point later. Scientists were not really debating global warming anymore. They had, in fact, an estimated plan for, if nothing changes, this is how much the globe will warm in the next few years, and this is how that will impact the environment, and those reports are very scary. Ozone holes are growing and becoming more frequent, and scientists estimate that they would deplete the ozone as much as 40% in a year. So there's some serious panic about the ozone disappearing, leading, of course, to global temperatures rising. Basically, people are really concerned. Here are all of these disasters. When's the next one going to hit? Here are the broad ramifications, and we hardly understand what's causing them. How are we going to fix them? We have no power over this. As early as 1990, the Gallup poll shows that about 76% of Americans would actively call themselves an environmentalist. Clinton hopped on that. In 1992, there was an Earth Summit meeting in Rio de Janeiro, and Clinton was determined to learn from this summit. He was determined to participate in this summit, and out of that summit came the Kyoto Protocols of 1997. And the summit basically said, okay, what's the problem? We're going to pick a couple of things that are an issue. One is deforestation. Another was the fact that wealthy countries are investing in poor countries and causing disasters there. Another was fossil fuels. So basically it said we all collaboratively as an international community can do these things. And those protocols came out finally in 1997. They set environmental goals. They set a timeline. They actually blamed industrialized first world countries for many of the damages that were happening to third world countries, which is how that international capitalism had worked, right? We talked about globalization in the last class. And those were backed by the UN. And remember that the UN has a significant amount of power to enact economic sanctions and even to send troops, although they've never done so for an environmental reason. I don't believe so. Don't hold me to that. So this was a really, really, really good agreement, and the United States hopped on board. However, we also know that there are still significant problems. There are significant problems because international agreements on the climate you're not going to listen to me if I keep that up. International agreements on the climate have always been fraught. There was the Paris Accords, and Trump pulled out of those. The United States president has the right to negotiate these international things, and they can decide to simply not be part of them. Trump decided to not be part of them because he thought that it regulated businesses too much, and that was a key part of the Republican platform. So what happens after this moment, after Reagan really, is that environmental regulations become politicized into parties. Is this a Democratic thing or a Republican thing? It was really important to Obama to be part of the Paris Agreement. It was really important to Trump to pull out of the Paris Agreement, which he did. And we know that despite that, we live in a world that is suffering environmentally. Most of you know this. So NASA's research now shows that 97% of actively publishing scientists, and this, by the way, was 5 years ago. No. Yeah, 5 years ago, this statistic came out. That scientists agree that man-instigated climate change is a serious issue. The other 3% agree that climate change is a serious issue, but disagree on the fact that it is man-made. In any other area, 97% would be an overwhelming number of people to support the basic understanding that man-made climate change is real. But I find it really fascinating that so many people continue to be climate change deniers. because climate change has become a political issue. And this is one of the areas where people are really a lot less focused on facts than they are on a political platform. And it's why Republicans tend to be climate change deniers. And I realize that if we were in class, I would get a lot of pushback for this, but you have to understand the historical relationship between ignoring climate issues and the Republican desire to see a non-interventionist government. Those two things relate to one another. So we know that climate change is a serious issue. We know that it is not just about making the world hotter, but we know that it is causing rising sea levels. We know that it is causing greater storms. We know that it is causing wildfires. We know that it is leading to the extinction of certain animals. We know that these things are all problems. We also are having serious issues about whether or not the federal government can limit business. These things are happening all over the United States. The most recent controversies are about fracking and about the Dakota pipeline. So these are problems about can companies destroy the environment? Should the federal government prevent them from doing so? How much should the federal government limit business? And that is a question that is different that is differently answered if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And we're all dealing with the fact that public infrastructure, which was created a long time ago, many of these cities, especially cities like Detroit and Cincinnati, really developed in the 1940s and 50s. Now, cities that developed earlier, like Pennsylvania and New York, have had to redo themselves enough. But cities like, and that's not true 100% of the time, but cities like Detroit especially, cities like sort of Midwestern cities and cities like Dallas and Houston that came up later and were developed in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, much of that infrastructure is lead. Most of that infrastructure is lead pipes. Funding takes a lot. It takes a lot of money to fix that problem because you have to tear up all the pipes. And it's an issue that disproportionately hurts poorer communities, which is exactly what I wanted to bring up next. So what I had you read for your homework today was a very interesting article called Environmentalism Was Once a Social Justice Movement. The thing that I would do to start that question, how did we get to there? Sorry, is basically this. Do humans experience environmental degradation equally? Think about that question for a half a second while I have a sip of coffee, which I would get to do in class. The answer is no. We do not experience environmental degradation equally. The way that climate change impacts me is very different than the way that it impacts somebody else. And that's because we live in an unequal society. A society that, in fact, was becoming much more unequal, especially after Reagan's administration, after the kinds of economic reforms that he implemented. You are all going to think I'm a liberal nut, but I'm going to challenge you all to tell me why I'm wrong. One of the things that became clear as inequality and class discrepancy increased in the United States was that environmental problems impact certain people more than others. Think about the effects of segregation. Segregation had led to the clustering of poor people, of Black people in particular, in inner cities. Because of the historical legacies of segregation that we talked about, that led to increasingly tight urban communities of Black people. Those are the communities that don't have a lot of economic power to fight back, and so those are the communities that industries would dump waste into, or those are the communities that don't have parks. Those are the communities that are still lead-based in their pipes, right? So segregation is a major issue, and segregation is both by class but also by race, and those two things relate. Think about employment. People in higher economic tiers are less exposed to danger. So take, for instance, me. I'm very lucky. I am a professional and I work on a campus and I have very limited exposure to environmental problems. But that's not true for someone who mines coal. That's not true for someone who does your nails and spends all day in that toxic fume. That's not true for someone who works in sewage, right? So employment makes a really big difference in how much people experience environmental degradation. Access to healthcare, too. Do you have good access to healthcare? Because you need healthcare to deal with the consequences of environmental degradation. If you don't have good access to healthcare, you're going to suffer more. Likewise, housing. Do you live somewhere that is a tightly impacted environment? Think about the way that hurricanes would impact Houston, right? Think about the way that people are impacted more if they are in housing that is not structurally sound or housing that is crowded. Think about, too, the effects of globalization. We're talking about more and more investments abroad by American companies. These things are devastating the rainforest, but we tend not to care about the rainforest. That is a problem for other areas, even though the U.S. is a huge part of what caused that. Cost of goods, too. When I buy, I don't know, Maya. Oh, actually, Maya's a great example. When I buy dog food, I buy very good dog food because I can afford very good dog food. And that very good dog food is dog food that is not primarily grain. But if you have to buy poorer dog food, cheaper dog food, that dog food is going to be composed mostly of corn and cheap meats, and those things hurt the environment. So the cost of goods, or think about meat. Meat is another good example. What if I wanted to buy a chunk of meat, which you know that I'm a vegetarian and I won't, but if I wanted to, it would be environmentally more friendly to get grass-fed bison, but grass-fed bison is also super expensive, so I'm probably not going to get that. I would get cheaper food that hurts the environment more. And education. How much do you know about these things? How much can you avoid environmental degradation? So these are all really important questions, and these are some of the reasons why environmental problems are not experienced equally. Environmentalism, in other words, is a social justice issue. What can you do? It's really fantastic to recycle and ride your bike, but those things aren't enough. There's actually a lot that you can do, and this is a point in the lecture, and I know that I'm getting on a pretty long lecture today. I would focus on a lot of these things. I want you to think about ways that you could do each of these. I want you to think about the ways that buying local helps the environment, right? If you don't buy things off of Amazon, things aren't shipped, and shipping is causing a lot of environmental devastation. If you are able to reuse things or recycle them, that's always helpful. Vote for politicians that are not going to do this shit, right? That are going to support the EPA. Read labels to understand what is in things. Try not to get, what are those things called that are in parabens? The little plastics that are in things like face wash. Try not to get those. Make your own things so that they don't come in plastic. There's a lot of things that you can do. I want to talk about the two most controversial things on this list, which are eating vegan and limiting childbirth. Because I'm a pain in the ass and I want to talk about those. The meat industry is a horribly environmentally destructive industry. This is not a controversial fact. This is because growing livestock requires a lot of land and a lot of water, and moving livestock requires a lot of gas. And because animals poop a lot. So because of that, meat is incredibly environmentally destructive. One of the best things that you can do for the environment is limit how much meat and dairy you eat, and get the meat and dairy that you do eat from ethical sources, which is of course much more expensive, but it's one of the main things that people can do. When Peter Singer published his book, which I will not go into forever, even though it's the best book in human history and you should definitely read Animal Liberation, is that not just that animals deserve equality, which is what we talked about before, but that the environment was significantly suffering, and that the environment suffering was part of that inequality. The other thing that you can do is voluntary childlessness. This one is even more controversial, but I want to play a clip for you again from a movie because I'm a cool professor, and none of y'all watch The Matrix because I'm old. Wait, hold on.
We're all
we don't have
living
to
a
watch
new...
this. I think I pulled it up somewhere else. Yeah, this is from The Matrix. This guy's not human, by the way, that's about to talk.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species, and I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment. but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply. And multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
Okay, I love that because it's timely, Corona, but also because... No, come on. Dang it. Just exit out of all of that business. Okay. I love that because it's timely, but I also love that because it's hard to debate. The problem, one of the biggest problems of environmentalism is that there are simply too many people. There are simply too many people. It's not just that, like, people drain the environment as adults, but also think about the environmental cost of raising a kid. The diapers, the toys, the carting back and forth to school. The amount of environmental impact that a child has is ridiculous. Not having children or limiting the amount of children that you have is probably the singular most important thing that you can do for the environment. In addition to changing the way that you eat, because these things are insidious daily things that change habits. Now, this is where you would all fight with me. And I would tell you all that actually childlessness is awesome, and it's a thing that you should totally think about. And birth control is incredible, but that's a fight that I encourage you to have in the discussion boards about voluntary childlessness. And I am not at all worried about the decimation of the species. We're doing like flippin' fine as a species. But yeah, dogs are awesome. Dogs have much less of an environmental impact. So go dogs. And if you have babies, I actually love babies. Have you ever seen me around a baby? I'm like, I go apeshit. But I don't want any of my own because we're destroying the planet. So yeah, there's all the controversial stuff that I have got for you today. Oh, that's not true. I have one more controversial thing. A lot of books to read. Because a lot of people don't believe my more political lectures, I tend to cite them more. So things that you might want to check out are here for you. And other than that, that is officially all that I have for you today. Have a good day. This has been your History 106 class. Let's find out how to stop this thing.